No heckling in the back, please. Well, what a great pleasure it is to come back here 11 years after that amazing triumph. I need to acknowledge that no one in the UK, that particular contest began with a list in either the Telegraph or the Times that people had to vote for 10 battles, and then a number of us were nominated to try and present the case for each of those battles. And the truth is, I won because I was better prepared than anyone else. Not necessarily because I believe that Kohima and Imphal were Britain's greatest battle. I do believe that, but actually, you need to have a little bit of skill in debating to be able to score the points. I was also very lucky to be last, which meant that I could rubbish everyone else who had gone before me, and I did it ruthlessly. And I won, which is great. And that particular triumph followed a couple of years after Britain's greatest general, which was in 2011. I tell you all this actually because although it didn't have much of an impact in the UK, Britain's greatest battle, in India, and particularly in the northeast of India, it's had a dramatic effect. That particular debate in 2013, Britain's greatest battle, meant that the whole idea of the climactic events in 1944, that the whole idea that they had importance to the people of northeastern India, Assam and Manipur, was given a real boost. And people still talk about it today. And it really was quite important. It happened just before it must have been the 70th anniversary, and just after the Duke of York had been out and on his royal visit in 2012, which was incredibly important for us in the Kohima Educational Trust because it gave real perspective for the people of Assam and Manipur and Nagaland, and the idea that actually we had not forgotten them. So even though it was a small event here, it was a big event in India and remains so. So thank you all of those. Is there anyone in the audience here today who was there in 2000? All right, you're going to hear the same thing again too. There we are. So when I was invited to do this again, I thought, what do I do? And I went back to my notes for the debate. I thought, gosh, these are pretty jolly good. I've tweaked them a little bit, but you're going to get the same stuff. So basically, you're going to get my reasons why this is a very, very significant battle in history. But before we do so, I've got a little bit of what do you call those advertising? I've got a plug, that's it. It's a plug for a brilliant book by a young author called Hannah Watson. She's actually written 35 books. She's written many more than me, children's books. It's a fabulous book for young readers aged 8 to 14 or 8 to 16, covering the first phase of the war in the Far East. So it's the retreat from Burma in 1942, and it's also Operation Longcloth. It is absolutely outstanding. It's been published by the by the Gurkha Museum, and it's in aid of 3 charities: the the Gurkha Museum, Gurkha Welfare Trust, and the Kohima Educational Trust. So I think most of the books have been sold today. There might be a few left. 10 left. Please buy those books. We need to sell about 2,000 before we start earning some profit. It's a fabulous book. You'll love it. Adults, you'll love it. Give it to your children. Give it to your grandchildren. Give it to your great-grandchildren. We need to get the story of the Burma campaign out to a new audience. This does it in spades. And if we can sell 2,000 copies, Hannah will be able to write the second volume, which I think will be Kohima and Imphal. And we'll then persuade her to do a third volume on Burma 1945. She doesn't know it yet, but please do think about buying the book. It is a cracker. Right. So, were those joint battles of Kohima and Imphal the Britain's greatest battle? When I talk about Kohima, I also mean Imphal. So I'll try and shorthand this by just talking about Kohima. But the 2 battles in 1944, they were 2 separate battles within the same Japanese campaign, Operation Ugo. Were they Britain's greatest battle? As those very intelligent voters decided way back in 2013. Well, it'll be no surprise to you that I do claim that this was Britain's greatest battle. Let me tell you something about it as we start. In the first case, it's very clear to me that these great twin battles, Imphal and Kohima, which raged from March through to late July 1944, was one of the great turning points of the Second World War, when the tide of war changed irreversibly and dramatically against those who initially held the upper hand. The first great turning point was arguably at Midway in June 1942, when the US Navy successfully challenged Japanese dominance in the Pacific. The second was at Stalingrad later in that year, between August 1942 and January 1943, when the seemingly unstoppable German juggernaut in the Soviet Union was finally halted in the winter bloodbath in the city, where only 94,000 of the original 300,000 German, Romanian, and Hungarian troops survived. Quite an extraordinary, devastating blow to the Third Reich. The third was at El Alamein in October 1942. There's a bit of a theme here, 1942, when the British Commonwealth triumphed against Rommel's Afrika Korps in North Africa and began the process that led to the German surrender in Tunisia in May 1943. And the fourth, a couple of years later, was this battle, that at Kohima and Imphal, between March and March and July 1944, when the Japanese March on Delhi, as it was propagandized by Tokyo Rose, was brought to nothing at huge cost and human life, and the start of the Japanese retreat from Asia began. Adjectives such as climatic and titanic struggle really, in my view, to give proper impact to the reality and extent of the terrible war that raged across the forested hills of of what is now Nagaland during these months. Well, let's just go and have a little look at what the Japanese were planning. That the Japanese were even contemplating an offensive against India in early 1944 was a surprise to Allied planners who had given no thought to its possibility. By this time, Japan had reached the apogee of its power, having extended the violent reach of its empire across much of Asia since it had launched its first surprise attacks in late 1941. Its initial surge in 1942 into what was briefly to be Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was as dramatic as it was rapid. And 2 years further on, several millions of people across Asia labored under its heavy yoke. But by early 1944, as James Holland mentioned a little bit earlier in this room, the tide had turned decisively in the Pacific, the American island-hopping advance reaching steadily but surely towards Japan itself, its humiliated enemies fighting back with desperation, not very much skill, and with every ounce of energy they could muster. They were beginning to prevail in the fight, although the struggle on the landmass of Asia was a strategic sideshow in the context of a global conflict. At this time, the British and American high commands were totally occupied with Europe and the Pacific. The British and Americans were preparing for D-Day. The Soviets were advancing in Ukraine. There was a stalemate in Italy at Monte Cassino. The Americans were preparing to land in the Philippines. Germany and Japan were both in retreat, but not defeated. In this global context, India and Burma appeared strategically peripheral, even inconsequential. Yet in this month, at a time when on every other front the Japanese were on the strategic defensive, Japan launched a vast, audacious offensive deep into India in an attack designed to destroy forever Britain's ability to challenge Japan's control in Burma. Japanese commander, as many of you will know, was General Mutaguchi Renya. First name comes last in Japanese. A gutsy go-getter who had played a significant role in the collapse of Singapore in February 1942. His evaluation of the British position in northeastern India revealed that the three key strategic targets in Assam and Manipur were Imphal itself, secondly, the mountain town of Kohima on the road between Manipur, Imphal, and Dimapur, and thirdly, the huge supply base further back on the edge of the Brahmaputra Valley at Dimapur itself. If Kohima were captured, Imphal would be cut off from the rest of India by land. From the outset, Mutaguchi believed that with a good wind, Dimapur, in addition to Kohima, could and should be secured. He reasoned that capturing this massive depot would be a devastating and possibly terminal blow to the British ability to defend Imphal, to supply the Americans in northern Burma under General Vinegar Joe Stilwell, support the Hump airlift into China, and thereafter to mount an offensive into Burma. It would also enable him to feed his own conquering army, which would advance across the mountains from the Chindwin on the tightest imaginable supply chain. The ambition was to be able to seize all of the objectives for Ugo within 21 days, by the 29th of April, which was the Emperor's birthday. With Dimapur captured, the Japanese-led Indian National Army under the Bengali nationalist Subhas Chandra Bose could pour into Bengal, initiating the long-awaited anti-British uprising. Well, that was Motoguchi's plan. The essence of the battle for India in 1944 can be very quickly told. Motoguchi's 15th Army, about 105,000 men, 30,000 oxen, 16,000 horses, and about 10,000, about 1,000 elephants, advanced in 4 separate columns into Manipur. And I'm not going to go through a detailed analysis of the advance today. We don't have time. The Japanese made determined, even desperate attacks to seize their objectives. In the north, Kohima, with a scratch British and Indian garrison of about 1,200 trained fighting soldiers. There were lots of other soldiers in Kohima, as many of you will know, but very few of them had ever been trained to fire a rifle. About 2/3 of these men were Indian, were attacked by an entire division of about 15,000 men in early April, in fact, from the afternoon of from the morning in some cases, the 4th of April. Surrounded and slowly forced back onto a single hill, that's Kohima Ridge, they were supplied by air until relief came on the 20th of April, although the battle to dislodge the Japanese from Kohima continued bloodily. In appalling weather, the monsoon had arrived on the 15th of April, and terrible battlefield conditions through to early June. Further south, the Japanese plan entailed attacking Imphal from north, east, and south. The plan of the commander of the 14th Army, Lieutenant General Bill Slim, was to withdraw his forces into the hills and there to allow the Japanese to expend themselves fruitlessly against well-supplied and aggressive British bastions, the boxes that James was talking about earlier, equipped with tanks, artillery, and supported by air. The battle for Imphal in Manipur and for Kohima to the northwest and the neighboring Naga Hills settled down to a bloody hand-to-hand struggle as the Japanese tried to gain the foothold necessary for their survival. They travelled lightly, and reserves soon exhausted themselves, and further supplies were almost non-existent. This became the leitmotif of the debate between Motoguchi and Sato, which Fergal Keane is going to be talking about on film tomorrow. Just as the air situation was becoming critical for Slim through poor weather and shortages of aircraft, the relieving division from Kohima, the famous British 2nd Infantry Division that had last seen action at Dunkirk, began fighting its way towards Imphal, and the 4 beleaguered divisions began to push out from the Imphal pocket. By the 22nd of June, the 2nd Division from the north coming down from Kohima and the 5th Indian Division in the northern part of the Imphal pocket met north of Imphal, and the road to the plain was open. 4 weeks later, the Japanese withdrawal to Kohima began, and they called it the Road of Bones, the name of the brilliant title of Fergal's book. Now, of all the invading armies in history, it's hard to think of one that was repulsed more decisively and more ignominiously than that of Motoguchi's 15th Army in India in 1944. Its defeat was not the fault of the Japanese soldiers, who fought courageously, tenaciously, and fiercely, but of their commanders, who sacrificed the lives of their troops on the altar of their own hubris. The battle had provided the largest, most prolonged, and most intense engagement with the Japanese army yet seen in the war. It's the most important defeat the Japs have ever suffered in their military career, wrote Mountbatten exultantly to his wife on the 22nd of June 1944, because the numbers involved are so much greater than any Pacific Island operation. And at the time Mountbatten wrote that, he was absolutely right. Okinawa hadn't yet happened, nor indeed had Iwo Jima. But it's important to understand in the context of these battles that Slim was fighting a formed-up Japanese army in the field. It was an army-on-army engagement. It wasn't an army versus a garrison. And whilst I'm not imputing that the island-hopping campaign was less difficult, it was of a very different nature to that which was fought by Slim and the 14th Army in northeastern India. The extent of the disaster that befell the 15th Army is captured by a comment by a leading Japanese diplomat at the time, a member of the wartime Japanese Foreign Office, who lamented, "Most of this force perished in battle or later of starvation. The disaster at Imphal was perhaps the worst of its kind yet chronicled in the annals of war." Well, the latter comment might better have included the caveat Japanese to avoid charges of exaggeration, but his comment captures something of the enormity of the human disaster that overwhelmed the 15th Army. And a number of years ago, a few of us were involved in a Japanese documentary on the operation by NHTV. And fascinatingly, in Japan, the sense of failure, of military collapse, of defeat in the Second World War is referenced not by talking about Iwo Jima or Okinawa or Peleliu or Guadalcanal or any of the islands in the Pacific, but by Imphal. The Imphal operation is the name that the Japanese have given themselves to reflect the enormity of their failure in war, because this was the first time that a Japanese army had been defeated in battle. Not a Japanese garrison, a Japanese army. And it's important that we hang on to that reality and when we're assessing the nature of failure in war. The Indian Gurkha, and this is always difficult, the Gurkhas were part of the Indian army, but I split them out because the Gurkhas provided a third of the Indian army. So the Indian Gurkha, African and British troops of this remarkably homogenous organization, the 14th Army, had also decisively removed in 1944 any remaining notions of Japanese superiority in the battlefield, a thing that had bugged Allied morale ever since the Japanese invasion, which began in late January 1942. The importance of this victory in 1944 was overshadowed at the time and downplayed for decades afterwards by the massive victories in 1944, which brought the Second World War to an end in Europe and in the Pacific. But in my view, this lack of publicity and awareness doesn't remove the fact that, objectively speaking, the battles in India in 1944, epitomized in the Fulcrum Battle at Kohima, were an epic comparable with Thermopylae, Gallipoli, Stalingrad, and other better-known confrontational-type battles where the arrogant invader became, in time, the ignominious loser. This was a really quite profound failure of Japanese arms. Yet, the victory was hailed at the time more with relief than with triumph. Oh, what's happened there? Yes. Let me just make sure. Yeah, there we are. Because it was not a defeat. And this was a fundamental feature of the way in which London viewed the Far East. The Far East had been a failure ever since the arrival of General Yamashita in Malaya in December 1941. And even at the height of victory in June 1944, London was still fearful of failure in Kohima and Imphal. It was also seen as giving the Allies a new headache, the practicality of an offensive directly into Burma, which the chiefs of staff in London had long resisted, preferring the option of an amphibious assault against northern Malaya. So the idea in London, driven by Churchill, was that jumping into Burma to launch an offensive to reconquer Burma was akin to jumping in the sea to wrestle with a shark, or to depopulate the porcupine quill by quill, two of Churchill's famous sayings with regard to the danger of entering Burma. So, ironically, dramatic success in 1944 gave Churchill this new headache. He wanted to bypass Burma altogether. But the dramatic success of Slim's 14th Army in Assam and Manipur in 1944 opened up for the first time the prospect of the reconquest of Burma by land. And this, in 1945, is precisely what, against every expectation, it achieved. And sadly, we don't have time to discuss that great campaign here today. If you want to listen to me pontificate on 1945, you can go to the Kohima Educational Trust website, where there is a number, I think we've got about 20 or more webinars on various aspects of the Burma campaign, and you can fill your boots, as they say, and enjoy them. But the 1944 victory was not only a turning point in the war against the Japanese, but it precipitated the reconquest of Burma in 1945. So it did two things. It defeated the Japanese, defeated the first Japanese army in its history. It also opened the door to the reconquest of Burma. The Japanese invasion of India in 1944 was also the last time Britain was forced to defend its empire, a declining enterprise at the time. Suez in 1956 and the Falklands in 1982 were hangovers, in my view. New and old empires collided in India in 1944. And in the searchlight of history, neither had any right to be there. However, the British victory was profound. It did not, as some had feared, strengthen British determination to bolster her empire, at least by military means, but rather confirmed its perception that the time was approaching when it should give it up. In the short term, it made a dramatic impact on the morale of the Allies, fighting back the tide of fascist militarism that had appeared at one stage unstoppable. Although it made little impact on the final outcome of the war against Germany and Japan, it had undeniably strategic consequences. So any of you who've read Armageddon by a historian called Mr. Hastings can ignore his abject denial that this war was peripheral to the strategic ambitions of the Allies. I argue entirely the opposite. Politically, it removed any claim that India was ripe for civil war. It had just succeeded in defeating the greatest threat that had ever come against its shores. The possibilities to the militant nationalism of Subhash Chandra Bose were never a match for the peaceful and powerful drive for political self-determination led by Gandhi and Nehru. It also demonstrated forcefully to the Japanese the harsh reality of defeat. And if you've read my book, A War of Empires, you'll appreciate the argument about how important it is for countries to recognize they've been defeated in the field militarily, because it punctures the balloon of martial imperialism. It removes the idea that the way to achieve imperial greatness or national greatness by martial means is, frankly, rubbish. Their earlier defeats had ousted them from or destroyed them in territories which they had captured. This is the Japanese. They suffered this defeat in 1944 when they were attempting to advance. If you heard James Holland a little bit earlier in this room, he described how Motiguchi believed that a march on Delhi was achievable. And that balloon was also punctured. In the physical defeat of the Japanese in India in 1944, the hard lesson was taught to a nation previously drunk on expansionist ambition, an expansionist ambition going back to 1884, 1885, that aggression of this type had no long-term reward and belonged to a previous, less intelligent age. It's effectively the last chapter of A War of Empires, but I do believe it passionately. It's important that we understand it as well. Now, to really judge whether the suggestion that this battle was a great battle, we need to start by defining our terms. What is meant by a great battle? Well, let me just try and find out. There we are. So I think that to define a great battle, we need at least some criteria, and I'm going to suggest 9. So we know a little bit about this, the enormity of the Japanese invasion. We know that it was undertaken by a formed-up army in the field led by one of its foremost commanders. We know that it was defeated substantially and was run out of India in July and August along its road of bones where large numbers of Japanese died. I mean, incidentally, numbers are very difficult to come by, but just to give you the sense of Kohima, with an invading force of about 20,000 men crossing the Chinwin in the last week of March 1944. By the time there were 3 significant engagements at Sangchak, Karasom, and Jisami by the 31st Division. By the time Sato's division arrived in dribs and drabs at Kohima on the morning of the 4th of April, and in the days that followed, the first really significant attacks on Kohima Ridge began on the 6th of April. He had probably got about 15,000 troops. By the time he was forced to retire on the 3rd of June, by my count, he had probably 1,500 left, between 1,500 and 2,000 left. And if you listen to James's description of the casualties in the admin box earlier, it's very similar. We're talking about 70 or 80% of all Japanese troops fighting in the Naga Hills dying, not being taken prisoner or wounded, but dying. It's really, really quite an extraordinary defeat. Okay, let's go through these criteria very quickly. First, the intensity of the combat. We're talking about a great battle. How do we define a great battle? First of all, the intensity of the combat had to be severe. We're not talking here about a skirmish or a quick assault before breakfast and a cup of tea, but a major conflict of arms, and this is what Kohima was. Second, it also has to be an occasion of crisis in which the fate of the nation or issues of real strategic significance are at stake. It couldn't really apply to operations that were long in the planning, like Gallipoli or even D-Day. I wouldn't place D-Day as a great battle in the sense that I'm describing it here, because it wasn't a turning point. We can debate that, but that's my view. Third, it has to represent that point, that it's a turning point in a campaign, for better or for worse. It was a turning point for the Allies. It was a dramatic turning point for the Japanese because it burst their balloon. I've used that analogy 3 times. I clearly like it. It meant that they had that their aggressive intentions and ability, their capability to fight, had been removed. Fourth, a great battle is one in which clear victory is achieved for one party and clear defeat for the other. Fifth, it's one which has evenly matched opponents. I've actually thought long and hard about this since 2013 and conclude that for a battle to be judged great, it needs to be much more than a one-sided match, even if its scale and size means that it contained considerable bloodshed and high drama. The 2 armies that are coming together need to be evenly matched. And the 14th Army was evenly matched with the 15th Army in terms of numbers. The 14th Army, as you will all know, of course, had a very different tone to that which it had in 1942 and 43 when it had been Eastern Army, but it was a new army, but numerically they were matched. Sixth, the battle needs to be one which has historical significance above and beyond the clash of arms and the human drama of the occasion. I'm talking here about the political impact of the invasion of India. Had it succeeded, we might have had a very, very different short-term future for India. I don't for one moment believe the Japanese could have secured India, but just imagine what might have happened if Motiguchi's legions, Sato's troops, had landed and come out of the hills at Dimapur, captured Dimapur, which was unprotected at the time, with Subhas Chandra Bose trumpeting loudly from the sideline saying the invasion of India was at hand. The march on Delhi was underway. West Bengal, as it was then from the mid-1930s, was the most nationalist province of India, and we might have seen some quite significant local unrest. I don't think it would have extended much out of West Bengal, East Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, but who knows? It would have been a very, very significant political event. Seventh, it needs to be one which took place in a dramatic setting, physically and perhaps geographically. And for all of those of you who have been to the Naga Hills, you know what I mean. Fourth, just make sure that I'm going in the right order. We don't want to mess up here, do we? 8. That's absolutely fabulous. This is why staples are actually quite helpful. 8th. I'm glad to see you're following this. It needs to be one in which the caliber of the soldiers involved and of the leadership demonstrated contributed measurably to the outcome. So we needed significant command abilities to be demonstrated. We needed to have soldiers fighting as soldiers are trained. It needed to involve new methods of war fighting with perhaps innovative methods of defeating the enemy. No prizes can be awarded for unintelligent slogging matches that produce nothing but high butcher's bills. So it seems clear to me that the scale of the battle and the number of casualties incurred cannot be a proper measure of greatness. So even though some of those battles in Eastern Europe involved millions of men and some women fighting each other, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were more significant than this. It also seems clear to me that a number of other British battles, we've mentioned El Alamein, Cassino, Arnhem and Waterloo, for instance, all had the qualities I've just listed, but so too does Kohima and Imphal. So what, in my view, makes Kohima unique? Well, I'm going to propose a list of 11 reasons that, in my view, moves this battle merely from being great to being the greatest we as a country have ever fought. So here we go. First, the boldness, audacity and shock of the Japanese offensive into India in March 1944 challenged the defense of India and thus not just Britain's ability to wage war against the Japanese, but to govern India itself. Second, the dramatic recovery plan put in place almost overnight, including the mass airlift of 2 divisions, the famous 5th and 7th Indian Divisions, directly from Arakan, directly to the battlefield at Kohima and Imphal, by men who had never flown an aircraft before. And a third, the famous British 2nd Infantry Division, dispatched 2,000 miles across the length of India from its encampment in Bombay. Quite remarkable. Third, the challenges posed by the extreme physical conditions in the vast spread of mountains that separate India from Burma. For those who don't know, the rains come in May each year and they last until October. And the rainfall in this part of the world ranges between 300 inches a year and 500 inches a year. So stop complaining about your 28 to 34. I know we've had a very wet season, but this is serious rain. The Khasi Hills, where I've just come from last Sunday, Shillong, have the highest recorded rainfall in the world, 500 inches. So, and this all comes between April, late April and October. And when it comes in great quantities. It's a significant physical problem. Fourth, the do-or-die nature of the fighting. The Japanese had to destroy the British in the mountain border with Burma, and the British had to stop them. Great things here were at stake, including perhaps even the security of India in a war with the toughest enemy any British army has ever had to fight. Fifth, the clash of cultures between the two countries represented a profound separation of worldview, of behavior and attitude to life that made this battle appear to be one between two entirely different species. Sixth, the fact that this battle, combined with its precursor in Arakan the previous month, represented the first defeat by the British of the Japanese in battle since the Japanese had swept into Southeast Asia in December 1941. The victory enjoyed by the 14th Army in India was thus of profound significance because it demonstrated categorically to the Japanese that they were not invincible. This was to be very important, as I've mentioned, in preparing the entire Japanese nation to accept defeat and to recognize that a negotiated peace settlement on their terms was out of the question. The arrogance, that was my first balloon, the arrogance of Japanese militarism was that it believed unquestioningly in the myth of the samurai, that they were unbeatable in battle. When a few years ago I interviewed a Japanese veteran of Kohima, some of you will remember Masao Hirikubu, I asked him to explain the reasons for the Japanese defeat. We were having supper in a pasta restaurant in Piccadilly, and I asked Masao for him to explain the reasons for the Japanese defeat, and he lost his temper. We weren't defeated, and he was a very rational and reasonable man, as those who knew Masao would accept. We weren't defeated, he retorted angrily. We simply ran out of food and ammunition and were forced to withdraw. Well, that's one way of looking at it. Allowing the Japanese military and the Japanese people to know that they'd been defeated was the only way in 1944 and 45 of ensuring that militarism, so closely ingrained in the Japanese culture of the time, did not re-emerge after the war as it did in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. Seventh, it also demonstrated unequivocally to British and Commonwealth troops that they were able to confront the Japanese in battle and win. By 1944, British and Indian forces in eastern India had been strenuously retrained and prepared to withstand the extraordinary physical and mental demands required of men fighting the Japanese following the disasters of 1942 and 43. Bill Slim, who had taken command of the newly formed 14th Army in August 1943, was convinced that he could transform the fortunes of his troops, despite the many gainsayers who loudly claimed the Japanese to be unbeatable. The taste of victory in both Assam and Arakan in 1944 injected into the 14th Army a newfound confidence based on the irrefutable evidence that the Japanese could be beaten. Our troops had proved themselves in battle the superiors of the Japanese, commented Slim with satisfaction. They had seen them run. And I didn't listen to Christopher Jarry's talk, but on the 13th of May 1944, when Sergeant Waterhouse's Grant tank managed to get down the Bond onto the tennis court and destroy each of the Japanese positions, it was supported by men of the Dorset Regiment who stood up and cheered at the sight of the Japanese getting out of their trenches and running. This had never happened before. They'd never seen it before. This was unique in the story of warfare between the Allies and the Japanese. The Japanese ran. They ran down the hill past the traffic control point. They ran into Kohima town through Treasury. And the boys didn't even bother shooting at them. They just stood there and cheered. I mean, quite an amazing experience to have been there. And as I said earlier, this victory allowed Slim to conduct an aggressive pursuit in Burma in late 1944, and by mid-1945 to defeat the Japanese for a second time at Mektila and Mandalay, bringing about the profound collapse of Japanese arms in Burma that year, setting the seal on the progress of victory that had begun at Imphal and Kohima. 8. This was a battle in which the indigenous population were not passive observers of the fighting, but one who contributed significantly to the fighting and without whom British success would have been much less certain. And this man is Sovahu Ninu, who was a member of the Assam Regiment, a regiment that Charlotte Carty's grandfather commanded at the battles of Jessami and Kohima. Today is the 80th anniversary of the relief of Kohima, and Sovahu Ninu actually wasn't on the ridge at the time. He had gone north to Waka because he'd been injured by mortar fire at Karasom. And that particular regiment was recruited from Kazis, from the Shillong Hills, from Nagas, from Assamese, from Guwahati, many of whom the children came up to visit us in Kohima a few weeks ago, Kukis as well. People from all across northeastern India had joined the Assam Regiment and had fought in the defense of their homeland at Jessami and Kohima. 9th, this was the last great battle of the British Empire and the first battle of the new India. Approximately 87% of the 14th Army in 1944 and 1945 were Indian, all volunteers who made a conscious decision to fight against Japanese fascism. They weren't fighting for the British or the Raj. but for a newly emerging and independent India and against the totalitarianism of Japan. And I've been told this repeatedly by Indian veterans. In fighting with Britain against the Japanese, they were, in effect, affirming their own nationhood. The success of the Indian Army in 1944 and then again in 1945 can be seen as the birth pangs, therefore, a new India, democratic and soon to be free. We can debate partition, but we're talking about 44 and the move to independence. 10th, this was primarily a foot soldiers' battle, where the courage and dogged perseverance of the fighting men on both sides contributed to the awful and unrelenting drama of the battle. The fighting skill and tenacity of the Commonwealth soldiers in Slim's 14th Army proved to be a significant reason for their success. Although the troops, Indian, British and West African and East African alike, might still claim they were the forgotten army, by 1944 there was no doubt about the strength and depth of the hard-won esprit de corps that now lay at the heart of their army, a sense of what I would describe as moral power that was sealed in the heat of battle and the realization of victory. There's nothing like a victory to give one a sense of moral power. They had taken on the most fearsome enemy the British Army, and indeed the Indian Army, had ever encountered in their histories, and they had conquered. It was also a battle in which new and relatively unknown military leaders, sepoy generals, had emerged, triumphant as much in battle as in strategy. 11th, and finally, the battle saw the deployment by Slim of an approach to warfighting we have since come to describe as maneuverist. This means that he deployed his forces in such a way that he sought to defeat Mutaguchi as much by subtlety and guile as by confrontation and firepower. Don't get me wrong, firepower is an incredibly important part of the entire equation here, particularly British artillery. But Slim wasn't up for defeating Mutaguchi in a long slogging match, which is where the Japanese were actually arguably better. There was a much more subtle and nuanced way of defeating the Japanese, which was to draw them in to Manipur and defeat them at a distance and to exhaust them. And that's exactly how Slim fought his battle in 44 and succeeded in destroying Mutaguchi. The fact that Kohima continues to play a subconsciously integral part of British history can be seen in the fact that no remembrance ceremony today is complete without a recitation of those famous words. When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow we gave our today. For those of you who have been there, you'll know these words adorn the memorial to the 2nd Division in Kohima, just above the very noisy traffic control point, the place of extraordinary sacrifice in 1944, and to be honest, one of the most humbling places on earth. Well, Lord Louis Mountbatten called Kohima one of the greatest battles of history, of naked, unparalleled heroism, the British-Indian Thermopylae. But does all this mean that the twin battles of Kohima and Imphal were indeed Britain's greatest battle? Well, I hope you agree with me that the answer is unequivocally yes. Right, are there any questions? So you'll see that that's an argument. It's an argument. And I was up against, what was I up against? I was up against Waterloo and El Alamein and a whole bunch of other battles, all of which have a claim to this accolade. And whilst I'd never say that there was one battle above all others, I think I've given you enough evidence to demonstrate why Kohima and Imphal really was much more significant than most other people have ever given it credit for. And one of the great tragedies, so far as I'm concerned, is as a historian, is how little we know, how little we understand. You're all here today because you actually have some skin in this particular game, I would venture. And you would all accept most of my arguments, or some of them, and even the ones that you don't particularly agree with, you're happy to give me the time of day on them. Society doesn't. History is written by those who write the big books, and this is still a campaign that has very little deep historical resonance in our culture, which is why we're all on a campaign to change it. There is a question there.
Yeah.
Ryan.
Thank you. Just setting aside reason 12, that it's one of those rare British victories where there isn't an Irish general doing all the heavy lifting.
Oh, very good.
This is one of, and I'm going to say it's characteristic of a number of the battles that were talked about in that context, but this is perhaps one of the least homogenous armies that Britain has ever fielded against a purely Japanese army with one doctrine, and I know individuals have different views, but they're all Japanese army. They've got a single cohesive motivation there. Is the army at Kohima getting a net benefit from its, I hate to use the word, but I'm going to say it, diverse elements, or is it an extra challenge for Slim and the generals commanding?
It's definitely an extra challenge. So one of the things that really I wasn't aware of until I started researching A War of Empires was that, and I decry any use of the word British Indian Army. It wasn't the British Indian Army, as you all know. It was the Indian Army. It was the legally constituted army of India, and we had the British Army. The two combined were known as the armies in India. They did very little together until 1943, where a Gurkha, British, and Indian brigade were pulled together into operational divisions. They had different training. They used different pamphlets. Even in the Great Transformation in 1943, the British Army had its own jungle training pamphlet, and the Indian had its as well. They were entirely different. So that was one of the biggest challenges. I think that success at Kohima and Imphal happened despite the reality that Slim had to fight with armies that had not trained together. But there are the predominant army in Imphal was, of course, the Indian Army. And all the generals, with one exception, Uvri Roberts, were sepoy generals. Uvri Roberts was a Royal Engineer who had caught Slim's attention in Iraq, and he'd promoted him and given him command of the 23rd Division. The jury's out on his performance. He did a reasonable job, but the reality is by early 1944, they were all sepoy generals. The outlier, of course, is the British 2nd Division. And most of you will know that the 2nd Division under General Grover, Blackjack Grover, famous British division, really captures in its construction all the old, or most of the old county regiments in the British Army, was not intended to fight the battle in Assam. It was intended to operate amphibiously against Arakan. But in the great transfer from Pune across to Arakan, it was decided that the 5th and 7th would be sent into Dimapur and Imphal, and the 2nd Division, which only 2 weeks before, early April 1944, Montague Stopford, the Corps commander, had told Grover that there wasn't a role for him until there was. So it was the arrival of the 2nd Division which is the outlier in the entire story. And the 2nd Division fought well. With all the challenges facing it, it fought well. The biggest challenge it faced, actually, was its lack of experience. And this told dramatically in Kohima. The units that fought best in Kohima, and no one's ever done an operational analysis of Kohima, but there's an enormous amount of side conversations that have been going on for years. And it's a little bit of a sensitive subject, who fought better, the Indians or the British. The real challenge is that the 161 Brigade, which comprised the primary defence of the Ridge in April 1944, had been blooded very effectively in Arakan. So 4th Royal West Kents, 1st Rajputs and the 4th 7th Punjabs had, compared to the 2nd Division, enormously more experience of fighting the Japanese, and they knew how to deal with them. When the 2nd Division arrived, they took quite a while to get their head around how to fight the Japanese. And I'll say no more about that at the moment, but for various reasons, it's a sensitive subject. But the 2nd Division fought well. How it fought, in terms of its 3 brigades fighting individual battles, is another matter. Jag.
How much did the reporting at the time of the battles in the East back in Britain influence how this has been perceived?
It's a great point. There's been a lot of work done on news reporting of these battles, and the truth is, Imphal Kohima was a long way from home. It took 6 weeks for mail to arrive. Mail was going around the Cape of Good Hope. A lot of mail didn't arrive. Newspapers would arrive. The boys would read newspapers from 2 months before, and there was nothing in it about their own struggle in northeastern India. And this was a real challenge for them. This is actually ultimately why they called themselves the Forgotten Army. It became a badge of pride ultimately. But during the war, of course, the Allies after Quebec, actually in 1941, before the Americans had even arrived in the war, Churchill and Roosevelt had agreed on the Germany first policy, which is that if America joined the war, the first objective would be to defeat Germany. And that's really fundamental to understanding this. It was regarded, and has been regarded by many people, as a peripheral campaign. And yet if you ask yourself, and this is a really, really important issue in 1944 and 45, my argument is to ask yourself, what would have happened if Slim had not managed to reconquer Burma in 1945? The atomic bombs would have been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Burma would have been occupied, and the Japanese armies would not have been defeated in a way that we know they were defeated in 1945. And ask yourself the question about strategic effect and political implication then. Because what we do know is that it was critically important for Japan to realize that martial endeavor was not the way to achieve the development of its nation. This is something that it had set its heart to in 1885 and thereafter launched wars in Korea in 1904, 1905, defeated the Russians, of course, in 1904, and began an imperial adventure that at the heart of which was martial aggrandizement. So being able to defeat that entire view places, in my view, a different perspective on how important Burma should be seen. Burma should be seen as the 2 places where 2 of the 3 Japanese armies to be defeated in the field in the Second World War were defeated. Imphal Kohima, 1944. Mandalay Maktila, 1945. And where was the third? Does anyone know where the third was? Someone who hasn't been with me to India. Yes, Manchuria, 1945. By who? By Zhukov, yes, who created the idea of the operational maneuver group that you spent a lot of your time preparing to fight against. This was Zhukov's destruction of the Japanese Manchukuo army. Only 3 Japanese armies were defeated in the Second World War. Now, I've had people say to me, that's a tautology, Robert. Well, you're playing nuances here, but just think about this. If you're fighting a garrison that's not trained to fight as an army, that's a very different organization to fighting a trained-up army with proper divisions and armament and all the rest of it. And what we managed to achieve under Bill Slim in 1945 was the complete smashing of Motoguchi's legions, and then in 1945, the complete destruction of General Kimura's Burma Area Army, 2 really quite significant events before the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that goes some way to describing why, whilst at the time, people thought that this was a peripheral war. It's my primary argument against Max Hastings that this was a very, very significant operational war because it proved to the Japanese that their martial ambitions could never be achieved using the means that they had set out to achieve. long answer. I always give long answers, so I can't remember what the question was, but that's the answer you got.
Rob, this is an easy question. Well, it's a short question. My father commanded the 2nd Division 28 years later. Grover was removed from command under controversial circumstances, which we needn't discuss. What does interest me, there may be people in this room who aren't aware of senior officer casualties in the 2nd Division. And I'm thinking about brigade commanders and I'm thinking about major unit commanders. Could you please lift the kimono on that?
Oh, yes, definitely. There were 7 brigade commanders killed or badly wounded at Kohima. So every single brigade commander was wounded or killed in Kohima. This was a battle where there was effectively no front line. I mean, the whole story of the Ridge is really quite an extraordinary one of intermingling troops on both sides. So any idea that you have of a linear battlefield, just dismiss completely. It's a battle where, and this goes for Burma in 1945 as well, where the intimacy of war is fully recognized by everyone engaged in it. Charlotte's grandfather was killed in December 1944 by a Japanese sniper the day before he was due to be relieved. You know, this is the commanding officer, just as a man standing in a trench talking to another one. And, you know, whether you're a private soldier, a sepoy, a Jawan, or the commanding officer of the battalion, your life was as much forfeit as the next man's. Grover's dismissal has been well rehearsed. I've got developing views on Grover's dismissal, but there's a brilliant article written by Sylvia's father on Grover, which I've published on my Substack, which you can go back and have a look at it, and it's fascinating. My own view, very briefly, is that Grover was sacked because the deployment of his division wasn't as sensible as Montague Stopford subsequently believed it should have been. Effectively, and last February, I had a whole bunch of major generals who came out with me to Kohima, and I presented this theory to them, and we had quite an argy-bargy, but a polite one. But effectively what Grover did was he divided his division into 3 brigade groups, and they fought 3 brigade battles. He didn't fight a divisional battle. I think there's a way of arguing that actually he could have achieved a faster success in Kohima by using his division in 2 parts, not 3. And that's based around the primary purpose of Kohima. What was the primary purpose of Kohima for the British? It was to protect the road, to enable supplies to go down to Manipur. What was the primary purpose of the Japanese? It was to cut that road. That road could have been protected by the British without going up onto Naga Hill and fighting the 5 brigade battle. But that's an aside. That'll be for next year's book. And this argument will run and run, I'm sure.
Thank you very much. That's all we've got time for, unfortunately. I think a round of applause is due for Rob. As we conclude, I'll get on the stage, why not? As we conclude, I'd like to thank Rob for joining us today for this event. Don't forget you can buy a copy of the book A War of Empires from the National Army Museum bookshop just upstairs. Rob will head up there to sign copies in a moment. There's lots of events still to come this weekend. There is still some tickets available for you interviewing the Slims at 6 o'clock. Yeah, do come along to that. And just to say that the Kohima Educational Trust and the National Army Museum both have active programs that you can participate in to learn more about the history of the British Army. The Kohima Educational Trust run monthly webinars, and whilst the National Army Museum run free lunchtime lectures every Friday, they're both available in person and online, and you can find out more via our respective websites. Thank you, Rob, for joining us today, and thank you for the Kohima Educational Trust for developing this event. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.